So we're going to get started now. We'll let others join us as they have time. Uh, Thank you all for coming. My name is Moira Kelly. I'm the president of EXPLO, and I'm here tonight with Dr. Lorraine Besser, author of The Art of the Interesting: What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It. Welcome, Dr. Besser. We're so glad that you're with us tonight. And helping us tonight is Kate Barnes, who's behind that big E there. And she is EXPLO's Associate Director of Admission. We're going to begin tonight with a conversation, and we'll wrap up with a question and answer session. So as we go along, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So let me start with telling folks a little bit about you, Dr. Besser. I'm just going to read. Okay. So Dr. Besser is a professor of philosophy at Middlebury College, and her primary area of research is moral psychology. She's particularly interested in the topics of happiness and well-being, and her work frequently draws on psychological and neuroscientific research on these themes. She earned her PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her master's degrees from the UNC and the Claremont Graduate School. And she also earned her BA at Tulane. Before joining the philosophy department at Middlebury, she held positions at the University of Waterloo and at Stanford University. I want to read a quote from Alison Gopnik about your book. And Alison Gopnik is the author of The Scientist in the Crib. She's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a professor of psychology and philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. So on Dr. Besser's new book, she wrote, Lorraine Besser has done a remarkable job of integrating philosophy and psychology to suggest, for the first time, a crucial new element of the good life beyond the traditional philosophical ends of happiness and meaning: psychological richness. The idea is that an interesting, varied life is an end and value in itself. This is an exceptionally rich and creative idea. So with that, I have to ask, because none of us know really, what is psychological richness? What is this interesting thing?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And it's so nice to follow the quote from Alison Gopnik, who's always been um, someone I've really admired. And so psychological richness is a description of the impact of a particular set of experiences has on your mind. So we experience psychological richness in our minds when we have thoughts that stimulate more thoughts that change our emotions, that lead us somehow to be moved in a way that often really changes our perspective on things. And I think psychological richness is often the kind of thing that we experience when that we first experience perhaps in the context of reading a new book or experiencing a new documentary or having a really new and unusual experience. When we're confronted with the novelty of that experience, it really triggers this kind of cognitive stimulation within our minds. And that's really what the core of psychological richness is, this experience of free-flowing thoughts, emotions that are really unstructured and ones in which you really allow to just happen.
So one of the things that I thought was so interesting about your book was that you talked about psychological richness and the interesting, but you also talked about why we haven't really gotten there before, haven't really thought about that before, and why it's a missing element. And I think many of us have either ourselves or heard others say, oh, the pursuit of happiness, that's what we need to be doing. And you actually talk about that as being pretty limiting, actually, in some ways to a good life, which for some would just be mind-boggling. So why is the pursuit of happiness not necessarily going to get you to having a good life?
Oh, yes. And, it's mind-boggling, but I'm also curious as to how many people ever really experience the reward at the end of that pursuit. And what we know about happiness as it functions on a psychological level, is that it's really tied to this basic physiological experience of pleasure, right? And
Yeah.
various hormone neurochemicals of some form. And yet, what this state is designed to be, right? This happy, pleasant state is really just designed to be a reward for us doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. And so by its very nature, happiness is really going to be limited insofar as how much we can experience it. And when we get, as with any high, right, it can only stay that high for so long, and then it just goes back down. So I think the very nature of happiness is such that it is limited. And I really worry about us taking very seriously as a top priority the pursuit of happiness. We set ourselves up for a goal that's really not that sustainable. And we also, I think, miss out on a lot of other good things in life.
So I thought that was interesting when you talked about in your book that the pleasure is is many people see that as an end goal, but it's actually kind of the bonus points you get for doing something else.
Yeah.
And that's why it's fleeting in some ways. And that pleasure comes and goes. And so the pursuit of just that is naturally going to leave you empty in a lot of ways. So you also have
Mhm.
a section of your book that talks about the irony of fulfillment, which I'm particularly interested in this part because as we were talking a little bit before we started here today, many of us who work in schools or work with young people, particularly young people who are interested in achieving and going to good colleges, um, this this is an area that may cause us some problems. So can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, thank you. There's really two parts to the concerns I have about fulfillment, and both suggest point to the same conclusion that, it's really important, but it should play a narrower role in our lives than I think many of us think. So when we search for fulfillment, right, through pursuing something, through trying to achieve something, what we do is really narrow our focus on what we need to do to get there, right? And simply in virtue of narrowing our focus, we've just cut ourselves off from a lot of different and potentially valuable experiences. Of course, it's important to narrow our focus to get things done. But the more we do that, the more we really do tend to miss out. And the bonus that we're after, right? The sense of fulfillment that we're after when we achieve something, right? Is really something that is very elusive. We know a lot about research on people describe in terms of the arrival fallacy, right? This is the fallacy of thinking like, when I get this, it'll
Right.
make me feel great. The reality is, it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen that way. We accomplish many projects, and it's a very well known phenomenon experienced in many different areas of getting to a goal, experiencing that, finally having achieved or accomplished something, and then really feeling empty in the face, even as we have accomplished that. It's a natural kind of response, but it also really, I think it suggests that we ought to do more than just pursue things and achieve things. So when we do that, we're really just putting all of our eggs in one basket that may or may not deliver. And if it delivers, when it delivers, it depends on a lot of factors coming together, such as other people affirming that or it having some kind of impact on the world that we seek. And so it's a very unstable basis, I think, to root our good lives in. The
Well, yeah,
second, yeah.
yeah. Well, to follow up on that, I think one of the things that's interesting about that is you talked about the external factors. They're not in your control. This achievement piece, and you were about to say something about this, the second factor of this.
Yeah, yeah. So you absolutely like when things are not in your control, it's really important. It doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue those things, right? But it's also important to recognize the instability that delivers your pursuits. And the the point I wanted to wrap back to the point about the irony of fulfillment, though, because we just talked about the difficulties of fulfillment. But what I think is really important to bring out in this context is that when we fulfill ourselves by pursuing or achieving something, we're really only fulfilling one part of our minds, right? That
Yeah,
rational, that
yeah.
executive functioning part, right? So we're really only fulfilling that aspect. And there's a lot of other stuff to us, right? Happiness is important, and as well as is having interesting experiences. And certainly, while interesting experiences are also a function of our minds, they track a very different capacity of our minds than is engaged with when we rationally pursue something through making plans and pursuing those plans. We're harnessing one very great capacity of our minds, but there's a lot else that is important to recognize. And that's where I think the value of interesting experiences lies, because our minds are really capable of this unstructured cognitive engagement, right? We can go places in our minds, we can feel different things, we can explore our curiosities and engage in all kinds of ways using our minds that don't have the structure imposed on them that happens when we pursue something related to achievement or meaning or something along those lines.
So, one of the things that I was reading in your book is that sometimes when we're in pursuit of a goal and we're really focused and we want to get there, that we drop sometimes friends, we drop family, we drop fun because we need to do that to achieve whatever it happens to be. And that can actually be a sacrifice that we make to get ourselves to whatever it happens to be, which we hope that once we arrive, we will be happy and but in fact, that doesn't exactly happen when we do that to the exclusion of losing all of this. And it's a convention of sorts that you talk about. And can you talk about that as a convention, because this isn't new. I mean, this is
Yeah.
the ancient Greeks. I think Aristotle was talking about this, like this is what you should, use the rational mind. Don't it? So how did we end up in a place like this?
Yeah, and well, I think that it started even with these ancient Greeks, right? It was very common in ancient Greece to think about our minds and to attribute to our minds this kind of hierarchical status of reason, right? Reason is the best, most important thing about us, they held, and a life of using the mind thereby is the best life possible. I don't think we can ignore the fact that these are also men who, very privileged men, who are making these arguments. And
Yeah.
certainly in the time of ancient Greece, men like Aristotle and Plato, they weren't raising the kids. They didn't have to um, engage with other kinds of struggles, and they were able, they had the privilege of just living this very, I think it's a narrow life of the mind. And the
Yeah.
reality is, though, so I think these conventions go deep. They go deep within our history of thought, and they go deep within our history of patriarchy. It's very, I think, common to hear that, we ought to be using reason and that we ought to, in order to really live good lives, we have to make the best use of this and find meaning and attain purpose and all of these things. And again, these are important, but I really want to push back on the fact that these are the best and only ways for us to succeed.
No.
We're human beings. We're not just little rational creatures in our head. We're human beings. We have desires, we have needs, we want to feel pleasure, we have capacities to experience different kinds of things. And so I don't think there is, I think that our tendency to privilege our rational capacities is indeed just a convention that goes back to a time where it served a purpose for a certain group of people.
And it sounds like it's just really limiting to lead a life of that. I
Yeah.
don't want to say just the neck up because I think, one of the things, well, here's a question that I have for you around the interesting. So you talk about the interesting as being something that you can own, that it's not externally related and it's values oriented to you, and it's within your own mind. But I'm also wondering a little bit, it's within your own mind, but within your own mind and your body? Is there, so that I'm kind of wondering, there's the cognitive aspect of the interesting, and also how it relates to the body and the experience and living out in the world. Like what is the connection between these things?
Yeah. Yeah, I thank you for asking that. I do. It is, the interesting experiences are located in the mind, and so they're a form of, cognitive engagement. But the way in which interesting experience engage us really puts us in closer contact and connection with the environments around us, and I think really with the world. One of the most exciting things I think we're seeing in the current research on psychological richness is its correlation with self-expansion. And by self-expansion, we don't mean like the bigger and bigger your ego gets, right? But we're talking about just how it is that you interact with the world and how you locate yourself within that world. When you open up your minds and really engage with your experiences, with your environments, with people around you, you really set yourself up to connect on a really much more robust level than you do when you're always focusing on one particular kind of aspect of things. And so I think that it harnesses, it's there's nothing, nothing in our minds is separate from our bodies. And I think that harnessing this power of really developing a capacity to have interesting experiences allows you to bring a certain mindset to the world that really enhances and gives you this greater kind of sense of participation in the world. And one way in which that happens, of course, is through listening to our bodies and what we're engaging in, and to be able to, for example, harness what we see, what we sense, what we feel, and then to explore it with our minds.
So some folks I'm sure with us tonight are like, this is making total sense. And there might be folks here who are like, I'm not following this. So can you give me one example you had in your book? He just happens to be someone I find really fascinating. Is you, and there you had a number of folks that you talked about in your book, but you talked about, or you wrote about Oliver Sacks, and as someone who um, pursued his curiosity, found the interesting, found wonder in the world, and we all for folks who don't know who Oliver Sacks was, a physician and a prolific writer, really interesting. And can you talk a little bit about? I'm just kind of like, in some ways, looking to ground your research in the interesting in someone, to talk about their experiences as an illustration of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Oliver Sacks is a great model of the kinds of way of living that is really dominated by psychological richness and interesting experiences. And what's really neat about Oliver Sacks, right? As you said, he's a neurologist. He is very skilled in many areas, right? But he's very skilled and he's very successful in his
Oh,
work.
incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's so much more to him. When we learn about Oliver Sacks, what you see is this man who not only is this, infamous neurologist studying these very weird and unusual diseases of the mind, uh, but also someone who thrives on motorcycles, right? He writes of going on motorcycle adventures during his weekends off and just riding for hours and hours and hours. And you can imagine that, right? And talk about the kind of self-expansion and following a passion and just engaging in an experience that he must be deriving from these rides. He also really loved ferns. He has an entire book about his excursion with the Fern Society and the adventures that he's had on that. And what I think we can learn from all of these different angles to him. He was also a world famous weightlifter, right? He was known
Oh, I
on
had no
on
idea.
Muscle. Yeah, he had some nickname. I can't pull it up, but he was really involved on Muscle Beach in Venice. on
Oh,
muscle, whatever
oh,
that was in
yeah.
Venice Beach. Uh, but I think if you look at what's really happening here, and how it is that he's occupying so many different roles, is that he's really clearly in tune with his passions, and he lets them drive him, right? When something sparks him, right, he doesn't think, oh, well, should I really pursue my love of ferns? Should I take 6 weeks to adventure with a group of people I've never known? Will I not be able to publish this paper because of it, right? He doesn't seem to have thought that way, right? What he seems to have done is been really in touch with his passions, know what makes him thrive, and to follow them.
Yeah, it seems like he has many layers to his life, that he's a
Many layers.
complex person. Um, and for I believe that there's a program on now, I don't even know what it's on, Peacock or something, that is based on Oliver Sacks. I think it's A Brilliant Mind. There's a program, and I'm only saying this because the guy rides motorcycles. He's a neuroscientist and he loves ferns. So I'm suspecting that that's where this came from. Yeah.
I'll have
So,
to look at that. Mm.
so you, uh, so you started. Let me pull back a little bit. You started in philosophy, and we were talking before you started that you went to UNC. You ended up taking a Phil class, and boom, it really excited you. How did you get into this area though? Because this is kind of an emerging area of psychological richness. So how did this all come about?
Yeah, over the course of my career, I started out just very, as you just said, philosophy just immediately clicked with me. The way of thinking, the way of analyzing, immediately clicked with me. And I spent many years um, focusing primarily on historical works. I'm a big fan of David Hume, 18th century Scottish philosopher, and my dissertation work was exploring just on a kind of an interpretive level his theory of moral motivation. At the same time I was writing that, there began to be some influential people in our field exploring the basis that our philosophical ideas had within empirical research. And it's actually surprising that it took that long. This was in the 2000s that
Okay.
philosophers first started really saying, well, there's some research on this, and let's figure out how to connect the two, or how they should operate together. And at that point, I just began being really curious about, like, are Hume's ideas, do they hold true? To what extent do they hold true? And so I began to read more psychology, and develop this approach to philosophy that's very interdisciplinary. So it's empirically informed, in which I read a lot of psychology, and then I think about what we can do with it and what it teaches us. So I'd been working in this field for a long time when I was approached by Shigehiro Oshii, who is a psychologist and had the original idea that all of our research about the good life had left an important piece out, and that was psychological richness. And he invited me to collaborate with him to assist in kind of carving out the theoretical framework of psychological richness. And importantly, what the initial research projects were about was to try to show that it was very different from our dominant concepts of the good life, which is happiness and something like meaning.
Yeah.
So he had this hunch that there was something really valuable, and the task was to really figure out, well, is it already contained within happiness and with our other discussions?
Okay. Yeah.
And then we determined that it wasn't, and that this was something new, and research was showing it's valuable. And then I'm thinking about, as a philosopher, like, why is it valuable? And that brings me to the interesting. And so there's a whole kind of different layers to how we got to this point, but fundamentally at root, what drove the research behind psychological richness was recognition of this fact that our dominant discussions of the good life, which trace back to Aristotle, were really missing something important in life.
So I think he's a psychologist and he's at the University of Chicago. And I think he's got a book
Mhm.
coming out next month.
Yeah.
You are pulling in work in psychology to your work in philosophy.
Yeah.
You're all doing psychological richness, but Do you approach it somewhat differently, given that your area of focus is philosophy versus psychology? How is it a little bit different?
Yeah, so in psychology, right, the dominant aim of psychology is descriptive, right? Where it's like empirical research explores and tries to learn about our various thought patterns, right? And in this context, empirical research is studying kind of what the nature of psychological richness is and how, the space, the territory it occupies.
Okay.
And psychology is really a descriptive subject, right? It's interested in studying the mind and learning from it, whereas philosophy is really a normative discipline. And by that, I mean, we're always pushing to think about what could be the case and what
Okay.
ought to be the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and so as a philosopher, when I engage and with this research on psychological richness, right? I mean, of course, I'm interested in the theoretical construct, right? And how it is really what makes it different from these other areas of the good life. But I'm also thinking about why it's a good life. And,
Hmm.
we have research showing that people, the empirical studies show that people, choose it and value it. And so that a lot of people really identify it with it as a form of the good life. But that isn't enough from our philosophical point of view to show that it's good, right? That people value, people can
No.
be wrong. And so as from the philosophical point of view, the really interesting question for me is like, well, what's out there that's making these experiences so good? And I I began to think that what was unified the range of experiences that create psychological richness was how they feel within our minds. And that's the quality I seize on in terms of the interesting. Right? And then there's a parallel structure we can think about with pleasure, right? So happiness is a state that we experience, in terms of pleasure, right? It generates positive affect within us. And pleasure, philosophers have long argued, right, is a valuable thing, right? That it's pleasure that makes happiness good, and that things are good when they're pleasant. It's very kind of basic form. We know it as hedonism. And my suggestion, my real contribution to this is to say that, well, actually, pleasure is not the only kind of good experience that we can have, right? Experiences can be good when they're not pleasant, and experiences are good when they're interesting. And
Okay.
so in harnessing this idea of the interesting and exploring kind of what that means for me, what that means in the context of how we can live good lives and understand what the interesting means for each of us, because what we all find interesting is going to be something different. And so my approach within this book is to really uh, present through my eyes my interesting experiences, things that I find interesting, and to really offer the reader the tools to try to develop for themselves a sense of what's really interesting for them. And I think that's really important because if we can capture and isolate and know that feeling, right? I mean, think about how important we know what feels good, right? What feels pleasant,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Sure.
And if we can just capture that feeling of things being interesting, experiencing that in the mind, then we are really putting ourselves in this position to be able to better pursue it, to be able to kind of recognize it in its sparks and let it go. And so that's the approach that I've explored here in my book.
So so when we think about, part of your book is about cultivating the interesting,
Yeah.
like how you go about doing that. And we've got folks here tonight with us who are parents and who are educators. So I want to kind of look at cultivating the interesting in young people. And I don't know how many I mean, I think interestingly enough, I do think that many educators and parents have bumped up against this, but I don't think that it's necessarily been clarified as clearly as you have done so in your work. So if you are, let's start with parents. If you are a parent, how do you help your child do this?
Yeah, the first thing I think is really important to recognize is that children's lives are very psychological rich. They
Mm.
begin, I often refer to children, like the world is their oyster of interesting experiences, right? Everything's new, everything's interesting, and they don't yet have that processing going on to kind of filter things out. So if we think about how we treat young children, right, we encourage curiosity. We encourage them to notice things, right? I spy something else, right? We
Oh, yeah.
encourage them to be creative. We encourage imagination in their minds. And at some point we stop. And I think that's so I think recognizing that first and foremost, right? That children are actually primed. And I think a lot of what we need to do as adults is to reimagine ourselves as children so we can bring that open perspective to the world. And so it shifts at some place. And I I have my suspicions about when that shifts, but at a certain point, as parents, we become really invested in training our children and raising them to be successful. And that
Mhm.
involves, of course, being really able to make plans, to develop our executive functioning, and to achieve. And I don't know, my experience of children, my children are just entering the college age. And my experience of high school, certainly of secondary education, was certainly that it was very limiting, right? And what the way in which we go about teaching writing or teaching other things is really very focused and I think a little it's constrained and for important reasons, right? I mean that ability to focus and to pursue something and achieve it is important. Yet I also think that we tend to overestimate its importance and at the cost of encouraging more creativity and curiosity.
Yeah. So if so on it sounds like what you might be supporting some notion of balance that it doesn't sound to me. You have a PhD. You went to very good schools, right? You teach in a
Oh
very
yeah,
good college now, right? So you understand the need to focus and to be able to develop the skills and habits and dispositions that
yeah.
allow you to do those kinds of things. Um, but it also sounds to me like you are a little bit cautioning people that don't put all of your eggs into that basket, and that there should be time carved out to actually pursue the interesting. And so if that's true, what does it mean if I'm the parent of a child, allowing them to pursue the interesting? Does that mean they get to play video games all the time? Well, like what does that look like? What am I helping them to do? And is there, am I really just completely letting them go and do whatever they want to do? Is there prompting that I'm doing? Are there questions that I'm asking? What is my role in all of this?
Yeah, I think the best way in which we can develop more interesting experiences in life is to really develop this certain kind of perspective. And so I describe it in terms of a combination of, being curious about things in an open-ended way, right? Often I think perhaps that being curious is just about finding answers, right? But we can Google our answers, right? That kind of curiosity is not that
Yeah.
exciting, right? But the sense of curiosity that explores different possibilities, right? That's something that's really important, and then that's not going to get taken away from us, I feel. So as parents, right, we can really just encourage our children to be curious about different things, right? And sorry, I have all these three different factors here, right? But so curiosity is one thing that we can just simply encourage by just asking them, like, well, what do you think about that? Well, what do you think would happen if someone took a different direction, or what do you think would happen if these kids
Mhm.
went out and
Yeah.
did this? Like, what else could happen? again, getting back to that, like really trying to seize into their innate sense of curiosity and ability to explore while also, modeling it for them. I also think, I describe the mindset of the interested in terms of three things. It's curiosity, creativity, and this form of mindfulness that involves just basic noticing our environment. And, I think there's it, the more usual our patterns become, right? The less we just notice about what's going on outside of us. But even by the simple fact of like, well, what do you notice about that wall today? Or what do you
Ah,
notice about the bookshelf? I'm sitting in an office I've habitated for 16 years. I guarantee you I could like look and find something new if I just looked out and noticed. And that ability, right, to notice things and find something new is really what's going to like serve as a central point of connection to our experiences, but also as a jumping point too. Because once you notice something new, then you can think about it being new, and then you can be curious about it, and you can also be start to be creative. I I talk a lot about in my book about how too often, I think, and this is certainly how reflective of my own experiences, that coming to think of being creative as really just located to the arts, right? And I think within our school systems, we often do this, right? So we have our magnificent. I hope we all have magnificent art programs and music and creative artistic ways to express your creativity. Yet creativity is it comes in all different areas. And essentially, creativity is just about forming connections, right? This is what, there used to be this right brain, left brain way of thinking about things. That's just wrong, right? So, creativity and current sciences maintains this, right? That creativity is just about forming new connections. And I think there's many ways as parents, but also within the school classroom that we can encourage that kind of creativity outside of the arts. And again, that's just by encouraging and asking someone to form new connections or to see, well, what does this remind you of, right? And why? And to start them on that train and then allowing them to really keep going on it.
so, you make me think about the notion of curiosity, but just kind of like just wondering about something all the time. And I, the notion of a young child wanting to go out and explore, I just remember I moved a lot as a child, and for a little bit of time lived in a suburb of Chicago. And I lived probably close to a mile from school, but there were many ways that I could go to school. And I would go to school one way and walk home another way each time. And I would do this every day differently, basically because I just wanted to see how things changed. What was happening in somebody's yard? Was the dog still going to be? It was just
Yeah.
something, it was a novelty. And I think that's one of the things you talked about was the notion of novel experiences. My mother, when she found out I was doing this every day, was not so happy because she thought I should go the same way so she could find me. But um, that notion of I wonder a little bit. I have seen a big difference over the past maybe 20 years of our ability to allow our children to explore. Um, uh, uh, and I understand the safety issues and all sorts of other things, but it feels a bit like we have cocooned people a little bit more. And in doing so, our desire is to keep them safer, and in fact, we limit them more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognize that we can explore with our minds.
Mhm.
And so novelty is really highly correlated with psychological richness. It's one of the best things to start at. So yeah, we can experience psychological richness really easily by taking a different route home. Absolutely, and exploring actual new physical spaces. but we can also maintain this sense of exploration by encouraging someone to explore with their minds. If we just kind of, you did an excellent job of modeling this as a child when you notice different aspects of the lawn, right? And we can be holding our child's hand, walking them home on the same route, yet
Yeah, okay.
encouraging them to explore with their minds.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think we have to see it as standing in
And either
tension with the,
or. Yeah.
yeah,
And so I want to move this a little bit to schools. And you talked a little bit about connecting things. When you think about this as both a function of a classroom or how we structure a day, um, what are things that we can do as educators to help build this?
yeah. I So one thing I think we can do is actually in our assignments and in what we ask of children to or students to make connections. And I've been thinking about this a lot within my own classroom. I teach college students, and we're really grappling with with the emergence of AI. And
Yeah.
so one of the things, and it's, I don't really know what to say about it yet, but I mean, we all know it's coming, and I think one of the things that AI is going to be really great at is the 5 paragraph essay, right? Is following a structure and finding evidence and writing that really essential skill. I don't want to relinquish it, but I think that I'm recognizing that there are other ways within the classroom to teach students that go beyond our normal patterns, right? Our normal expectations. And so one thing I've been doing a lot within the classroom, and I found it to be really effective, both in giving students the power, internal power to know that they don't need to use AI, but also helping them to learn, is by having them connect the material with their experiences. And so rather than, for example, explain to me what this theory is and what's wrong with it, I've started to ask students, well, how do you see this operating within your lives? And how how's it going? And I found that to be a really, that's a way of making connections, right? So the person is not now just doing this kind of one-sided analysis of something, right? But really trying to find the touchstones between their personal experiences or something that they can connect with it to this material. And so they're writing in ways that are very productive, and they're very personal, and they're learning a lot about it. And I'm finding that they're also, in connecting the material with their own experiences, they not only get a better understand, they're developing the understanding I want them to have about what this theory is, and they're also getting pretty far in recognizing where the limits or the problems might be. And these are things that typically I would ask students to do in a very straightforward way, like explain the theory, critically analyze it, give me the evidence, and do this kind of thing. And I found that I'm getting the same kind of results in turning learning experiences through this very different kind of way that encourages, again, just this kind of like forming connections and being creative in our minds about what we want to do with the material that we're learning and what it makes us think about. And that's engagement with the material, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's what we want. And it's also something that AI isn't going to be able to do for us. It's not going to be able to really connect a theory with our own personal experiences, or dictate or predict, right, what we'll be thinking of it.
Yeah, one of the things I'm wondering about is how much of the interesting is about seeing things differently. And I don't it's interesting because I don't necessarily mean when you first take a look, but that somehow there is a pursuit of whatever it is that makes you over time, your relationship to it changes. And I'm just kind of because one of the things that you talked about in your book is this kind of siren call of the interesting, right? That there is a magic, just kind of unstructured engagement. It's kind of like I don't want to.
Yeah.
This is how I read it. It could not have been, is that things are turning over in your mind, and one thing leads to another, and it leads to another, and it leads to another. And it's not in pursuit of a particular goal or achievement or level or something. It's just kind of like, oh, this is connected to that. And then it leads me to this and it leads me to this. But it just creates all of these different layers of things that are happening. And that, and in some, I hadn't thought about this before, but that there's some comfort in that, that you can live in a big,
Oh,
wide
yeah.
life in your own mind in some ways.
Yeah. I think that's the best advantage. I mean, that's a real something that the that psychological richness has, and that is really differentiates it from the other kind of things we're after in the good life, right? We've talked about the limits of happiness and the instability of pursuits of fulfillment and meaning, but you can create interesting experiences within your own mind, and that's just it's amazing, right? You know, it's
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
literally develop the ability to enhance your own experiences. And you don't even have to change things in your life, right? It is about developing this kind of mindset that allows you to engage with whatever's going on with you in this different kind of open way. And the siren call, right? To thinking about the siren lighting off, right? To this tracks the importance of really recognizing the sense of interesting building within you, right?
Oh,
Recognizing
okay.
when
Okay.
something's really
Yep.
resonating with you.
Yeah.
And if we can learn to recognize that feeling and then allow ourselves to go with it, right? That's that's really at the heart of what we're after here. And in my book, I present, you know, just a list. Anyone can find these lists, like a list of random facts or something, right? And then I encourage the reader to say, okay, well, what's jumping out at you, right? We'll look through the list, and many things will be like not standing out, but there's going to be something that just stands out and really captures you. And that's the feeling, right? That's the feeling of that siren of the, you know, that's the interesting sparking is just being in touch with this, our the way in which something can resonate with us and just tap into something within us, and that's how we learn it. So we can all do that. Pull up these lists. Every time I go back to listen to my book, I'm actually sparked by a different element on it. And so things are different, right? But the important thing is to just kind of learn how interesting experiences feel for you, and then to really be able to let them go.
So is this a skill? Okay,
Yeah,
so this is actually a skill that people can develop through
yeah,
practice by doing this. And if
yeah,
that is true, then I'm going to go back to young people.
yeah,
Not young people, because little kids are just doing this all the time anyway. But that it sounds like we really need to be thinking as parents and educators about how we foster this, how do we cultivate this skill with young
yeah,
people. And if part of this is there can't be a really specific end goal in mind, part of what we're trying to do is get people, whether it's looking at lists or whatever it happens to be, to go, oh, there's something there, that we're really trying to cultivate sparks in people, and
yeah,
to understand where those, that this is what a spark is, and my life when I have them is more interesting and better and full than when I don't have them. And that's just an interesting thing. I I keep on using this, I know it's interest
it
psychological,
is, it
right?
is.
Like this notion of like, how do we think as educators if this is really important to a kid's well-being? Um, and I have to wonder too, is this the thing that really develops passion in people, or can develop passion in people, which is the thing that may lead you. I'm thinking kind of like you in philosophy. Oh, that was it. This thing just kind of pulled me in, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Is how we do that, particularly in a world right now where the level of engagement for many students at school is, 0. pretty low, you know.
Yeah.
And so I just want to encourage anyone, if they have any questions, to pop them into the Q&A, since we're getting kind of close here to the end of time. And I, I have a suspicion that there's more to your work that is probably coming down the road that you will continue to be doing, and both good for adults, which is wonderful for those of us who are here who are adults. But it does make me wonder about, since we are so focused in so many schools on really supporting the well-being of our young people, and if this really is a crucial component, then what do we have to do, as educators, to make sure that we're actually doing work to make that happen with them? And I just want to thank you so much for being with us tonight, because this is so interesting. And I want to repeat the name of your book. So it's The Art of the Interesting and What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It. And that's by Dr. Lorraine Besser. And I will say this, and I think I sent a note to you when we were first talking about you doing a webinar. I was so taken by the fact that this was a philosophy book that was written in a way that regular people could read it, and had wonderful illustration examples, and was pretty captivating in its writing. So you're a very good storyteller. So
Thank
I
you.
say that because this is not a really heavy duty philosophy tome, but actually something that's, I think, really useful. And you have a great appendix in the back, uh, and I can't recommend it more highly. And then I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and I hope we'll be chatting with you sometime again in the future. All right,
Yeah, thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
All right, take care.
All right,
Goodbye.
thank you.